that a woman's place is looking after her man and her children, and I think a man's place is to look after her, to protect her, and provide her with a little warmth. I really do believe
you have the old-fashioned concept, right?
Yeah, but it's fairly sweet. I mean, the women's liberationists, if they thought about that. Shh! Quiet, woman! Women's liberationists.
The Tonight Show was the most powerful platform in American entertainment. One appearance could make your career or end it. The pressure was enormous. The green room bar was top shelf, and by the mid-1970s, the entertainment industry was swimming in cocaine. Everything happening in Hollywood was walking through those doors every single night, said a television historian. Johnny Carson saw it all, the one man who held it all together without breaking a sweat. This is the Tonight Show nobody talked about. Number 10, George Carlin. Sharpest mind in comedy. Completely, serenely, professionally stoned. By 1972, Carlin had undergone one of the most dramatic reinventions in American comedy. The clean-cut, suit-and-tie club comic of the early 1960s, the guy who did safe impressions and charmed Ed Sullivan, had been replaced by something the culture had never quite seen before. Long hair, jeans, material that went right at the nerve, and a relationship with marijuana that was, by his own cheerful admission, essentially continuous. He appeared on The Tonight Show more than 130 times, more than almost any other comedian in the show's history. And for most of those appearances, according to virtually everyone who worked backstage during that era, he arrived with what one camera operator delicately described as his creative process already well underway. George wasn't hiding anything. Recall the floor director who worked dozens of Carlin spots. That slightly glazed quality in his eyes, that half smile that was already going before Johnny said a word, that was just George in his natural state by that point. The crew loved it. You knew the next 8 minutes were going to be genuinely interesting. What made Carlin unique among the chemically enhanced guests of the Tonight Show era was his absolute functional precision. The weed didn't muddy him. It slowed him down in exactly the way that made his observations land harder. He would follow a thought to places a sober comedian might have pulled back from. He'd sit with an idea a beat longer than expected, let it breathe, then arrive at a punchline that felt like it had been carved rather than constructed. Carson understood this instinctively. He developed a specific interview approach for Carlin that differed from how he handled almost anyone else. He'd throw out a topic, language, religion, American hypocrisy, death, and then do something he almost never did with other guests. He'd get out of the way. Johnny would toss George a subject and then just lean back, explain to former Tonight Show writer. He'd nod, he'd react, he'd laugh, but he was essentially the net under the trapeze. George was flying. Johnny was just making sure no one hit the floor. Despite appearing 130 plus times, Carlin was never once asked to guest host the show. That distinction went to dozens of other, less frequent guests. The reason, according to those who knew Carson well, was never stated directly. It didn't need to be. Johnny respected George enormously, said a former producer. But 90 minutes of live television is different from an 8-minute spot. He wasn't sure George could hold the whole thing together for that long, and he wasn't willing to find out on the air. Carlin later addressed his Tonight Show appearances in his autobiography with characteristic directness. Was he stoned during his Carson spots in the 1970s? He said of course he was. It was the 70s, and he was George Carlin. He suggested doing the math. The math, as it turned out, almost always added up to brilliant television. While Carlin represented a kind of artisanal, productive relationship with his substance of choice, our next guest brought something considerably more volatile to the desk, a genius so raw and unpredictable that even Johnny Carson had to work like a man defusing a bomb. Number 9, Richard Pryor, the greatest stand-up comedian who ever lived. And some nights, a man who was somewhere else entirely. There has never been anyone like Richard Pryor in American comedy. Not before, not since. He took the stage and did something no one had figured out how to do. He made his own pain funny, and in doing so, made everyone else's pain funny too. He was raw in a way that made audiences simultaneously uncomfortable and completely unable to look away. He was by any measure a genius. He was also, by the mid-1970s, consuming cocaine at a rate that alarmed even the people around him who were consuming quite a bit of cocaine themselves. Pryor appeared on The Tonight Show throughout the decade, and the appearances are a kind of time-lapse portrait of a man burning at both ends. Early in the 70s, he was brilliant and relatively coherent, slightly loose, wildly funny, but navigable. By the back half of the decade, certain appearances had taken on a different quality. The brilliance was still there, but so was something else. He could start a segment as the sharpest person on the planet. Recall the stage manager who worked several of Pryor's Tonight Show appearances. Just absolutely incandescent. And then, somewhere in the middle, his eyes would change. Like a channel switching. He'd go somewhere else mentally, and Johnny would have to work like a traffic cop to get things back on track. One appearance in particular, from 1978, became a kind of legend among the show's staff. Pryor began a story about his childhood in Peoria, Illinois. It started clearly enough. Funny, painful, specific in the way only Pryor could be specific. And then, gradually, the story began to unspool. The thread connecting one moment to the next grew thin. He began talking about his grandmother, then about a dog he'd seen that afternoon, then about something that had happened to him in a dream. The audience laughed nervously. That particular laugh, uncertain, searching, was something the Tonight Show staff knew well. It meant people weren't sure if what they were watching was intentional. You could see Johnny shift gears in real time. The stage manager continued. He came in with a question, very specific, very warm, pulled Richard back toward the story, made a quick joke that gave the audience permission to laugh cleanly, then cut to commercial. It was masterful. I mean, genuinely masterful. Like watching a surgeon work. What distinguished Carson's handling of Pryor from his approach to other impaired guests was the depth of his genuine affection and concern. He wasn't managing a situation. He was protecting someone he cared about. Johnny would check on Richard through mutual friends after certain appearances, said a former NBC executive familiar with their relationship. He wasn't judgmental about the substances. That wasn't his style. But he worried. Richard was clearly in trouble, and Carson saw it up close in ways that the public didn't. Richard Pryor once told a mutual friend, according to a writer who knew both men, that he was grateful Carson would drive the car when he was too far gone to steer. He said Johnny could have made him look like a fool and instead guided him safely home. While Carson's protectiveness toward Pryor was born of genuine love for his talent, our next entry required a very different response. Because what walked through the curtain wasn't just impaired. It was barely present. Number 8, Truman Capote, literary genius, television catastrophe, author, social butterfly, and on one January night in 1980, an absolute disaster. In his prime, Capote had been one of the most electrifying talk show guests in America. Tiny, imperious, with that extraordinary high-pitched voice and a mind like a razor dipped in champagne, he could sit across from almost anyone and make the conversation crackle. He was one of Carson's genuine favorites, a regular throughout the 70s who consistently delivered the kind of wit and observation that made producers exhale with relief when he walked off the set, which is what made January of 1980 so stunning. From the moment he came out of the curtain, it was different, recalled the sound technician who worked that night. He was wobbling, not falling down drunk, but not walking right either. His eyes weren't focusing the way they should, and when he sat down and spoke, the words were coming out slow and thick, like they were moving through something. The control room, by multiple accounts, went into immediate crisis mode. Directors began cutting to reaction shots of Carson, always coherent, always expressive, as a kind of visual safety net. The audience could see Johnny, and Johnny looked fine, so things must be fine. They were not fine. Capote's combination of pills and alcohol. The precise chemistry was never publicly confirmed, but the effect was not ambiguous, had rendered him, in the blunt assessment of one production assistant who was present, completely baked. Not loose, not uninhibited, not warmly unpredictable, barely functional. Carson's response was markedly different from his handling of Carlin or Pryor. There was no playful adaptation, no strategic deployment of a guest's altered state for comedic effect. Instead, his questions grew shorter, simpler, more direct. His smile tightened at the edges. He was doing triage. Johnny was furious, said a former producer, the qualifier being important. Not on camera. On camera, he was Johnny Carson, which meant he was impeccable. But the moment they cut to commercial, he went backstage and told the talent coordinator very clearly, never again. He's done. What specifically enraged Carson, according to those close to him, wasn't the impairment itself. It was what the impairment represented. Disrespect. Disrespect for the audience that had tuned in. Disrespect for the show. Disrespect for the opportunity. There's a difference, explained a former NBC executive, between someone who is a little high but can still perform, still deliver something, and someone who is essentially incapacitated. Truman crossed that line. Johnny could work with the first category. He had no patience for the second. Capote was never invited back during Carson's tenure. One of the very few guests in the show's history to receive what amounted to a lifetime ban. While Capote's appearance was a cautionary tale told in sadness, our next entry brought something entirely different to the curtain. Two men who weren't hiding anything, weren't apologizing for anything, and were, by any honest measure, absolutely magnificent at it. Number 7. Cheech and Chong. Truth in advertising. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong. Cannabis culture's ambassadors to the mainstream. Exactly as advertised. In the history of The Tonight Show, very few guests arrived with their entire professional identity already baked, in every sense, into their brand. Cheech and Chong were not hiding their relationship with marijuana. They had built a career, an entire artistic universe on that relationship. Their albums were selling millions of copies. Their films were drawing enormous crowds. And when they came to 30 Rock, they came as themselves. They weren't putting on a show about being stoned, laughed a segment producer who worked on several of their appearances throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. That was just where their brains actually lived. You didn't need to wonder about the green room. You just knew. What made their Tonight Show appearances genuinely brilliant, and what elevated Carson's handling of them above mere tolerance, was the comedy architecture the three of them built together in real time. Carson, who could have played it straight and let them be curious zoo animals for the audience, instead made a creative choice. He became their straight man. Not a confused straight man. Not a disapproving straight man. A perfectly calibrated, deadpan, almost Buster Keaton-esque straight man who would pose innocent questions with widened eyes, then let the answers go wherever they went, while occasionally sliding a glance at the camera that said, "Yes, you are seeing exactly what you think you're seeing." He'd pretend not to understand a reference, recall the longtime camera operator, ask a completely guileless follow-up question, and they'd answer it with something that was technically an answer, but was also somehow about something else entirely. The audience was howling, because Johnny was in on it, and they were in on it, and everyone knew everyone was in on it. During one appearance promoting Up in Smoke, Tommy Chong began an anecdote about the film's production that started reasonably enough, and then gradually, inevitably, began orbiting its own point without ever landing. Carson let it go, let go further, glanced at the camera once, eyebrow raised approximately 1 millimeter. The audience lost their minds. "That eyebrow raise," said the segment producer, "that was worth more than a punchline. That was Johnny telling 12 million people, 'Yes, this is real. Yes, I see it too. And yes, isn't it wonderful?'" Carson's broader philosophy about guests was that his job was to make them look good. With Cheech and Chong, making them look good meant letting them be precisely, exactly, authentically who they were. Two men who smoked a great deal of marijuana and were funny as hell. Not despite it, but as part of it. While the Cheech and Chong dynamic was built on cheerful transparency, our next guest arrived carrying something much more disorienting. A substance that made coherent conversation not merely difficult, but philosophically questionable. Number 6, Peter Fonda. Easy rider, difficult guest, counterculture icon, and on one memorable evening in 1970, a man who had apparently left our shared dimension somewhere in the parking garage. By 1970, Fonda was riding the wave of Easy Rider's massive cultural impact. The film had made him a symbol of something: rebellion, freedom, the open road, the question of what America was becoming. He was one of the most recognizable faces of the counterculture, and his advocacy of psychedelics was not exactly a secret. When he arrived for his Tonight Show appearance that evening, the production staff noticed something immediately. His pupils, by the account of a camera operator who worked the show that night, were the size of dinner plates. He kept looking at the studio lights with an expression of concentrated wonder. When spoken to, he would respond, but with a slight delay, as though the question had to travel a very long way to reach him. You knew within 30 seconds, the camera operator recalled. This wasn't nerves. This wasn't alcohol. Whatever Peter was on, it wasn't from this menu. Carson came out, made the introduction, shook hands, and in the handshake, by all accounts, you could see him register exactly what he was dealing with. The questions began. Simple, standard, warm. How are you? What are you working on? Tell us about the film. Fonda answered. Sort of. He began talking about a new project, then transitioned mid-sentence into a meditation on the nature of time. Specifically on how time is not linear, but rather wraps around us, the way a blanket wraps around someone sleeping, and that we are all, in this sense, dreaming while awake, riding what he called the cosmic wave of consciousness. The audience was quiet, not the good kind of quiet. Johnny tapped his cards on the desk twice. Recall the director who was working the show that evening. That was our signal. It meant, cut to commercial, no questions asked, right now, wherever we are in the segment. We were maybe 5 minutes into a 12-minute interview. When they came back from the break, Fonda was gone. His chair was occupied by the next guest. Carson continued as though nothing unusual had occurred. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just the smooth, reassuring current of the Tonight Show moving forward the way it always moved forward. He wasn't angry afterward. The director continued. He told the producers, give him another chance in a year. Everyone has an off night. That was Johnny. No judgment, just practical solutions. Fonda did return in later years and delivered entirely coherent and entertaining interviews. The 1970 appearance became part of the show's internal folklore, a data point in the ongoing legend of Johnny Carson's unflappable grace under genuinely unusual pressure. While Fonda's journey into other dimensions was ultimately harmless, our next guest took The Tonight Show somewhere considerably more alarming. Not strange, but threatening. Number 5, Oliver Reed. The British Bulldog, off the leash. One of Britain's most formidable screen presences. And on a night in 1975, a very large problem. Reed had been famous in Britain for years before American television properly discovered him. Famous for his roles, yes, but equally famous for his capacity to consume alcohol at quantities that seemed to operate outside normal human physiology. He wasn't just a drinker. He was, in the parlance of a certain English tradition, a serious drinker. A drinker's drinker. A man who treated sobriety with the mild contempt of someone who had tried it and found it wanting. He arrived for his Tonight Show appearance that evening in a state that one NBC page who witnessed it described, with some understatement, as clearly not sober, not wobbly but charming, not loose and entertaining, loud, unpredictable, eyes burning with a kind of unfocused intensity that made experienced crew members take an unconscious step backward. Carson came out and shook his hand, and in that moment, according to multiple people who were watching from the wings, you could see something shift in Carson's face. Not alarm. Carson did not do alarm publicly, but an adjustment, a recalibration, the expression of a man who has picked up a glass, expecting water, and found it contained something considerably stronger. The interview began. Reed answered questions with rambling, slurred confidence. His volume kept climbing. He began interrupting Carson's questions, not with answers, but with counter-questions, non-sequiturs, sudden declarations that seemed to belong to a different conversation happening simultaneously in his head. Then he stood up. Security guys moved toward the stage. Recall the cameraman who was working that night. You could feel it in the whole room. This particular kind of stillness that happens when people don't know what's going to happen next, but are fairly sure it's going to be physical. Reed demonstrated something, a fighting stance, apparently, accompanied by commentary about his own physical capabilities. Carson, without visible alarm, used a technique he almost never needed: forceful interruption. Clean, firm, unapologetic. He cut Reed off mid-sentence, redirected, and began accelerating toward the exit of the segment with the focused efficiency of a man who has identified the door and is walking toward it. Johnny had zero tolerance for aggressive behavior, explained a former producer. He could handle stoned. He could handle drunk. The minute it turned volatile or threatening, that was the end. Full stop. After the cameras stopped, Carson was direct with his team. Oliver Reed would not be invited back. The reasoning, as relayed to the booking staff: he didn't care how large a star someone was. If they couldn't control themselves, they didn't sit at his desk. Reed's appearance demonstrated something the Carson era taught again and again: the difference between chemical enhancement that creates memorable television and intoxication that threatens the room. One was tolerated, even occasionally celebrated. The other ended careers at 30 Rock immediately. While Reed's appearance was defined by heat and volatility, our next guest story is a quieter one, suffused with the particular glamour and sadness of a man whose gifts were extraordinary and whose relationship with substances was, at a certain point, consuming both. Number 4, Dean Martin, the most effortlessly cool man in the history of American entertainment, and a man whose onstage relationship with alcohol was, by a certain point, more complicated than the audience ever fully knew. The Dino persona was one of the great constructions of 20th century show business. The loosened tie, the tumbler of amber liquid, the half-closed eyes, and the smile that suggested he'd been awake since Tuesday and didn't especially mind. Martin played the amiable drunk as a comedic character with such precision and commitment that millions of Americans couldn't be entirely sure, even after decades, whether they were watching a performance or a documentary. The answer, over the years, was sometimes one, sometimes the other, and increasingly both simultaneously. Carson and Martin had a complex relationship. They were of the same generation, the same milieu, the same understanding of what professionalism and entertainment required. When Martin was on, genuinely on, he was one of the most charming guests The Tonight Show ever produced. Warm, self-deprecating, surprisingly sharp beneath the languorous surface. But there were nights when the tumbler wasn't a prop. You'd see in the timing, recalled a former sound engineer who worked The Tonight Show for more than a decade. Dean's comedy depended on precision. He was playing a drunk, but the performance required being sober enough to control the beats. When the controls started going, the timing went with it. And Johnny could hear it before the audience could. One appearance in the mid-1970s became a quiet legend among the staff. Martin arrived in fine spirits, literally, and settled into the guest chair with his characteristic ease. For the first few minutes, everything was Dino in full flower. Smooth, funny, magnetic. Then something shifted. The responses began trailing off before they quite arrived at their destination. The eyes went somewhere slightly different. Johnny did something I hadn't seen him do before, the sound engineer continued. He started finishing Dino's sentences, very gently, very naturally, so the audience never heard the trailing off. They only heard the complete thought. He was holding him up from the inside, invisible the whole segment. The segment ended cleanly. The audience applauded with genuine warmth. Most of them had no idea they'd watched a rescue operation. What the Dean Martin appearances illustrated, and what Carson seemed to understand viscerally, was that the greatest entertainers often carried their damage and their gift in the same hand. Separating one from the other was neither possible, nor Carson seemed to feel his job. He cared about Dino, said a former producer. They were of the same world. He wasn't going to embarrass him. He was going to get him through the segment and make sure he got home. While Martin's appearances were lit by nostalgia and affection, our next subject was something entirely different. A force of nature whose energy, on one particular night, seemed to emanate from a source that the studio's electrical grid could not fully account for. Number 3, Sammy Davis Jr., the greatest pure entertainer of the 20th century. And on one hypercharged evening in 1974, a man apparently running on something considerably stronger than adrenaline. Davis was one of Carson's favorite guests. Full stop. There was no one like him. a performer of such extraordinary range and combustive energy that simply having him in the room raised the voltage of everything around him. He sang, he danced, he did impressions, he told stories that crackled with life. He was, by every account, genuinely irreplaceable. His 1974 appearance became famous among the Tonight Show staff almost immediately. Not for anything that went wrong, for the sheer, almost aerodynamic quality of what went right, at a velocity and intensity that left observers slightly breathless. He was talking a mile a minute from the second he sat down. Recall the sound technician who worked that evening. Couldn't stay still. Kept starting stories, then jumping to different stories, then circling back. His eyes were moving everywhere. He was sweating a bit more than usual under the lights. The energy was a lot, even for Sammy. Industry insiders who watched the clip immediately recognized the profile. By the mid-1970s, cocaine had become the social currency of entertainment circles in New York and Los Angeles. Present at dinners, backstage, in the bathrooms of clubs that everyone who was anyone attended. Davis moved in the very center of that world. Everyone backstage knew, said a production assistant who worked that night. This wasn't just Sammy being Sammy. The green room bathroom had been occupied for quite a while before his appearance, if you take the meaning. Carson adapted with his characteristic genius. Rather than trying to slow Davis down, which would have been like trying to redirect a river with a garden hose, he leaned in. He matched the energy where matching was possible, asked questions that fed the acceleration, and let Davis's rapid-fire storytelling create its own momentum. The result was one of the most purely entertaining segments the show produced that season. What saved it? What kept it from tipping over into something that audiences might have found alarming was Davis's own professionalism. Even running at twice his normal wattage, he remained charming, focused on performing, on connecting, on delivering exactly what people had come to see. The volume was turned up considerably. The quality never suffered. Sammy was a pro's pro, emphasized a former talent coordinator. Even if everything the rumor mill said about that night was true, and I'm not saying it was, he never crossed the line into unprofessional territory. He delivered exactly what the audience wanted, just with extra electricity. When the segment ended and Carson wiped his brow during the commercial break, he reportedly told his producer, "I think I just got secondhand exhaustion from that interview." It was said with affection. It was always said with affection where Sammy was concerned. While Davis's evening represented substance use that, whatever its chemistry, produced genuinely extraordinary television, our next entry is a story of a different kind. A rock and roll legend whose combination of substances and sheer size created a situation that had the Tonight Show security team quietly repositioning themselves around the stage. Number 2, Jim Morrison, the Lizard King, poet, provocateur, and the single most nerve-wracking guest in the Tonight Show's history. By the late 1960s, Morrison had become something that didn't quite have a category in American popular culture. He wasn't just a rock star. He was a phenomenon, a force, a person who seemed to exist slightly outside the agreed-upon rules that governed public behavior. His concerts had become events of a kind that police departments had begun taking seriously. His poetry was published in serious literary journals, and his relationship with alcohol, LSD, and virtually everything else available to a person with money and no interest in moderation was the stuff of genuine legend. He had no business being on The Tonight Show. He knew it. The producers knew it. Johnny Carson, who knew everything that mattered about everyone who sat in that chair, almost certainly knew it. He came out, tall, in leather, with that particular combination of physical beauty and physical dissolution that defined him in those years, and sat down with the energy of a man who had not slept in some time and was deeply at peace with that fact. The crew was nervous before he said a word. Recall the stage manager who was present that evening. Not starstruck nervous, actually nervous. Like when you're near something that you're not entirely sure is under control. Carson, to his eternal credit, opened with warmth and genuine curiosity. He was interested in Morrison, in the poetry, in the ideas, in the strange overlap between what Morrison was doing and the older traditions of American performance that Carson had grown up with. For a few minutes, something extraordinary happened. Morrison, responding to Carson's evident respect, pulled himself towards something close to coherence. It didn't last. The answers began growing longer and more recursive. Morrison started a thought about poetry, moved into a meditation on death, circled into something about the desert, arrived at a reference to William Blake that hung in the air without resolution. His eyes, which had been meeting Carson's, began moving to points in the middle distance that apparently contained things only he could see. Johnny kept going, said the stage manager. He asked a follow-up question about the Blake reference, just to give Morrison a handhold, to give him something specific to grab onto and pull himself back with. It worked partially for about 90 seconds. The segment ended before its scheduled time. No announcement, no fanfare, just Carson's smooth transition, the band playing something warm, the curtain of professionalism drawing closed over whatever had just happened. Backstage, Carson said only this, according to a producer who heard it. Talented kid. I hope he makes it. Morrison was dead within 2 years. The appearance is rarely discussed in accounts of the Tonight Show era. It sits in the archive like something preserved in amber, beautiful and sad and completely of its moment. Carson never spoke about it publicly. He didn't need to. His handling of it said everything. While Morrison's appearance was haunted by a sadness that only became fully visible in retrospect, our number one entry is different in every way. Louder, stranger, and involving a guest so profoundly altered that it triggered the only genuine panic the Tonight Show's control room ever experienced. Number 1, John Belushi, the most ferociously talented comedian of his generation. And on one extraordinary night in the late 1970s, the single most alarming guest the Tonight Show ever attempted to broadcast. By the time Belushi's career reached its peak, Saturday Night Live, Animal House, The Blues Brothers, he was operating on a kind of creative nuclear energy that those around him could barely keep up with. He was also, by well-documented account, consuming cocaine and other substances at quantities that made the rest of Hollywood's consumption look restrained. His capacity was enormous. His self-regulation was not. He arrived at the studio in a state that a production assistant described, without hesitation, as the most visibly impaired I ever saw anyone walk through those doors. Not stumbling, not incoherent, exactly, but running at some internal frequency that had no relationship to normal human wattage. Pupils blown wide, hands in constant motion, talking before he reached his chair, talking while he sat down, talking in the general direction of Carson without quite landing on a subject. The control room called down immediately, recalled a former segment producer who was working that evening, not to the talent coordinator, directly to the senior producer, asking whether to go to a technical issue and pull the segment before it aired. That's how bad it looked from up there. The debate lasted approximately 90 seconds. Carson, who had been briefed between a commercial break, ended it himself. He sent word back up. "We're going," said the segment producer. He said, "And I'm told this is almost verbatim, I'll handle it. Just keep the cameras rolling and let me drive." What followed was, depending on your perspective, either the greatest piece of live television crisis management in the show's history or the most remarkable comedy performance Carson ever gave. And it is worth noting that these two things are not mutually exclusive. Carson came back from the break and introduced Belushi with warmth that contained not a single visible molecule of concern. He shook his hand. He asked a question. Belushi answered it, sort of. He then answered 2 or 3 other questions that hadn't been asked, did a brief impression of someone that may or may not have been a real person, stood up slightly, sat back down, and launched into a story about filming Animal House that was genuinely, incandescently funny. The audience was laughing, said the segment producer. That's the thing. They were laughing because John Belushi was hilarious, even like that. Especially like that, maybe, and Johnny realized it in the first 30 seconds and made a decision. The decision was to let it go, not to manage and redirect and sanitize. To be the straightest possible straight man for whatever Belushi was doing and trust that Belushi's talent, that enormous, almost frightening talent, would produce something worth watching. It did. The segment was chaotic. It was not what anyone had planned. It contained moments that made the control room upstairs hold its breath. And it was, by the account of everyone who was there, absolutely riveting. When they cut to commercial, Johnny sat for a moment, said a floor director who was on the stage that night. He didn't say anything immediately. Then he looked up and said, "Well, that happened." And he smiled. The NBC executives who had been hovering nervously in the wings throughout the segment came down afterward. One of them, according to multiple accounts, asked Carson how he had stayed so calm. Carson reportedly considered the question for a moment and said, "He was funny. When they're funny, you let them be funny. That's the whole job." Belushi would appear on The Tonight Show again. He was always, even at his most untethered, funny enough that Carson found it worth the uncertainty. And Carson, who had spent 30 years watching people at their most exposed, most vulnerable, most human, seemed to understand something about Belushi that those around him were only beginning to grasp. He was burning, brilliantly, and not for very much longer. John Belushi died on March 5th, 1982. He was 33 years old. 10 guests, 10 stories, and one man who held the whole extraordinary, sometimes alarming, always human spectacle together with a grace that only looked effortless because he was that good. Johnny Carson's legacy has been described in many ways over the years. As television's greatest host, as the gold standard of late night, as the man who defined what an interview could be. In Carson's era, it was something else. It was television. It was a Tuesday night. It was Johnny, managing the unreasonable with his characteristic combination of warmth and steel, and then moving cleanly on to the next thing. That's why we still talk about him. That's why we still watch those clips, those small preserved rectangles of a world that no longer quite exists, and feel something that isn't quite nostalgia and isn't quite grief, but lives somewhere in between. He kept the show going. He always kept the show going. And he made it look, as he made everything look completely impossibly easy.